Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The true legacy. Was MLK really nonviolent? A televised interview from October 1957.
The corner of Decatur and Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, Alabama. A bus stop. There at the head of Dexter Avenue is the Alabama State Capitol. Jefferson Davis took his oath as President of the Confederate States on the steps of that portico. Montgomery is known as the cradle of the Confederacy. The Alabama State Judicial Building. And, directly across the street, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Reverend Martin L. King, pastor.
Good afternoon. I'm Martin Agronsky. Welcome to Look Here. On Thursday, December the 1st, 1955, a Negro seamstress named Rosa Parks was riding on a bus here in Montgomery. When directed by the driver to give up her seat to a white passenger, she refused. She thus defied a local segregation law, was arrested and fined. Now, by the special magic that occasionally makes a cause from a small incident, the Rosa Parks case triggered something quite unexpected and without precedent in the Deep South. On the following Monday, a Negro boycott of the city buses had begun. The issue itself was taken to federal court, and one day last November, nearly a year later, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation here in Montgomery was illegal. By then, the young man who had been chosen to lead this boycott was famous in every country beset by the problem of color. And he's the pastor of this church, Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, good afternoon. Dr. King, almost overnight, you became an international figure as a result of the bus boycott here in Montgomery. And because you used in the movement passive or nonviolent resistance. Why did you use this method, sir?
Well, in order to answer that question, I would have to deal with two aspects of the problem. First, there was the boycott, and then the emergence of the nonviolent emphasis. Now, let's deal first with the boycott. I would say that we decided to boycott the buses because the people felt that they could no longer accept the injustices and indignities inflicted upon them on the city buses. They felt that it would be more honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation.
What sort of injustices, sir, indignities?
Well, such things as having to stand over empty seats, and at times many of the bus drivers themselves were discourteous. There was a problem of paying a fare on the front door and occasionally having to go to the back door to board the bus. Many things like this. And the masses of people came to the point that they could no longer accept it. The cup of endurance had run over. And so after deciding to boycott the buses, we decided that the movement needed some discipline and dignity. And a boycott in and of itself would be a very dangerous thing if it didn't have some guidance. And after thinking through this, the emphasis on Christian love came into being, along with the whole Gandhian technique of nonviolent resistance.
Christianity and Gandhiism. Now, how do you mean? How did you apply that, Dr. King?
Well, I mean this, that if we think of a boycott merely as an economic squeeze, we were not boycotting. And I like to think of our movement here in Montgomery as more than a boycott, because a boycott is suggestive merely of an economic squeeze, and that can be a very unchristian thing. It can be immoral.
You anticipate really a question I was going to ask you, how you would reconcile the Christian ethic with an economic boycott.
Well, I think if it stops with the boycott and it doesn't have the element of love and nonviolent resistance, it is opposed to the Christian religion. I faced this problem at a very early stage in the whole struggle. How could this method be reconciled with the Christian faith? And at points I started thinking that this was a method used by persons at points who were seeking to defy the law of the land. And all of these things came to my mind. Then I reasoned that what we were actually doing was not exactly working on a negative, trying to put a company out of business. That was never our aim. We were not seeking to put the bus company out of business, but to put justice in business. We were dealing with a positive point. And I also reasoned that what we were doing turned out to be a very Christian act, because the system of segregation tends to set up false standards, and it scars the personality of the individuals of both races. And from that I came to see that the longer we continue to accept it without opposing it in some form, we fail to be our brother's keeper. Because as long as we sit in the back of the bus, it tends to give the Negro a false sense of inferiority, and so long as white persons sit in the front of the bus only, it tends to give them a false sense of superiority. And I felt that some leavening reality should come into being so men would live together as brothers and forget about distinctions, and that became, to my mind, a very moral element, and I came to see that what we were doing was actually massive non-cooperation and not so much a boycott.
Then you feel really that actually an acceptance of what you regard as evil is in essence a promotion of evil? Am I correct in understanding this was the basic philosophical thinking on your part?
Very definitely. I think it is just as bad to passively accept evil as it is to inflict it.
Gandhi, Dr. King, dramatized and defined the technique of nonviolence, and yet he also said that the only alternative to fear is violence, and that if that were the alternative, he would have to choose violence. Do you subscribe to that judgment of Gandhi, or would you disavow violence under any condition?
Well, I think I would have to somewhat interpret Gandhi at this point. I don't think he was setting forth violence as an alternative. I think he was emphasizing, or rather trying to refute an all too prevalent fallacy, and that is that the persons who use the method of nonviolence are actually the weak persons, persons who don't have the weapons of violence, persons who are afraid. And I think that is what Gandhi was attempting to refute. Now, in that instance, I would agree with Gandhi that if the only alternative to violence, to fear, is violence and vice versa, then I would say fight. But it isn't the only alternative. And that is one point that Gandhi was trying to bring out. It seems to me that there are three ways that oppressed people can deal with their oppression.
What are they, Dr. King?
Well, one is to rise up in open violence, in physical violence. And some persons have used that method, persons who have been oppressed. But I think the danger of that method is its futility. I feel that violence creates many more social problems than it solves.
May I interrupt you there, Dr. King? There are today certainly people who are forced to endure a kind of injustice that neither you nor even Gandhi in his time had ever seen. For example, would you regard the martyrs of Hungary's rebellion a year ago as misguided men in having used violence?
I admire freedom fighters wherever they are, but I still believe that nonviolence is the strongest approach. I think that would apply to the Hungarian situation also. I don't think it's limited to a particular locality. I think it should apply in every situation in the world where individuals seek to break loose from the bondage of colonialism or from some totalitarian regime or from the system which we confront in America.
You truly believe, then, that nonviolence is the sole, the universal answer to injustice and oppression?
Very definitely.
Lasting answer.
Very definitely. I feel that nonviolence, organized, I should say, organized nonviolent resistance is the most powerful weapon that oppressed people can use in breaking loose from the bondage of oppression. Now, the other method that one might use is that of resignation or acquiescence. But I think that is just as bad as violence, because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good.
You make a difference, a distinction between passive resistance and nonviolent resistance, is that it?
Well, I think that can be something of a semantical problem. If passive resistance means just passively accepting violence or injustice, if it means cowardice and stagnant passivity, then there is a difference, because nonviolent resistance does resist. It is dynamically active. It is passive physically, but it is strongly active spiritually.
In a sense, would you regard it as moving into the Christian philosophy too? You mean the doctrine of turn the other cheek to regard as positive rather than passive?
I think it is positive. I think very definitely, if it is used properly and accepted with the proper attitude, it is a very strong method. It is a method of the strong man, not the weak man.
Dr. King, the editor of the local newspaper here proposed an editorial the other day that I ask you to reconcile, as he put it, your passive resistance philosophy with your satisfaction, which you've expressed very clearly, over the use of bayonet force in the Little Rock situation. Well, I'll put that question to you. What is your answer to this editor?
Well, I might say that I did back the president in his action in Little Rock, Arkansas. I think it is quite regrettable and unfortunate that young high school students have to go to school under the protection of federal troops. But I think it is even more unfortunate that a public official, through irresponsible actions, leaves the President of the United States with no other alternative. So I did back the President, and I sent him a telegram commending him. Now, your main question is, and the question of the editor of our local newspaper here is, how does this jibe with my whole philosophy of nonviolence?
How does it?
I believe firmly in nonviolence, as I have already said. But at the same time, I am not an anarchist. Now, some pacifists are anarchists following Tolstoy, but I don't go that far. I believe in the intelligent use of police force. I think one who believes in nonviolence must recognize the dimensions of evil within human nature. And there is a danger that one can indulge in a sort of superficial optimism, thinking man is all good. Man does not only have the greater capacity for goodness, but there is also the potential for evil. And I think of that throughout my whole philosophy, and I try to be realistic at that point. So that I believe in the intelligent use of police force. And I think that is all we have in Little Rock. It's not an army fighting against a nation or a race of people. It is just police force seeking to enforce the law of the land.
And this would be your answer to the editor. To explore another facet of the Little Rock situation, are you satisfied with President Eisenhower's performance on the racial issue?
Well, I guess to answer that question, I would need to make a general statement. That is that the Negro has been betrayed at many points by both political parties. I don't want to make this a party situation. I don't think either party can boast of having clean hands in this area. It is my conviction that both parties have failed to take the strong stand in the area of civil rights that they could take.
Having called down a plague on the houses of both parties, are you satisfied with President Eisenhower's performance in this particular situation, Dr. King?
Well, with the Little Rock situation, yes. I think the president should be commended for the positive and forthright stand that he is now taking in the area of civil rights in general and in the situation in Little Rock, Arkansas in particular.
But you are dissatisfied with the overall performance of both the President's party and of the Democratic Party.
Oh, yes. I think both parties could improve, and I think both parties must come to the point that they see the moral issues involved rather than making a political football out of the civil rights issue.
The implication being you think they still are doing that.
At points, yes.
If you enjoyed this program, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and bell icon at youtube.com/KYCNmedia and receive instant notifications from KYCNradio.com, your official Israelite voice for the gathering of the people. Be sure to tune in every Saturday at 12 noon Pacific Standard Time for more groundbreaking revelation from our Rod of Iron program with Shaleakh Yashah on KYCNradio.com. Until next week, Shabbat Shalom, and YAH Khai HalleluYAH.
Shalom, shalom, saints. This is Pastor John Tatum, and you're listening to KYCN Radio.